Alexander Vance was, by any measurable metric, a god among men, a titan of industry whose net worth, a staggering $4.3 billion, was so immense it existed only as an abstraction. Yet beneath the impenetrable glass walls of Vance Global and the sterile, silent confines of his penthouse, a suffocating isolation had begun to set in, a cancer of cynicism that whispered that every smile, every handshake and every word of praise was simply an echo of his own immense power, and the realization that his wealth had effectively insulated him from genuine human connection became a crushing weight, a philosophical problem demanding a radical, dangerous solution. He needed to know if real kindness still existed in the world, the kind of kindness offered without the promise of a return on investment. So, with the decisiveness of a CEO making a hostile takeover, he initiated Operation Clean Slate, a plan to strip away his entire identity, trading his tailored bespoke suits for threadbare, unwashed denim, his hand-stitched Italian leather shoes for scuffed, worn work boots, and his meticulously groomed facade for the rough, unshaven look of a man who had been riding the rails for too long, his motive purely investigative, a documentary of the human spirit conducted not with cameras, but with his own raw, vulnerable self as the subject, deciding he would present himself as Ale, a recently laid-off construction worker whose luck had run out, deliberately choosing a persona that communicated not desperation, but simply quiet failure, because that kind of failure, he reasoned, elicited pity, not respect, and it was pity he was testing, not charity, and the target location for this unprecedented social experiment had to be far from the polished marble lobbies of Manhattan, somewhere gritty and real, where the struggle was palpable and genuine, leading him, by way of a borrowed decade-old pickup truck purchased strictly for the ruse, to the forgotten edges of a sprawling Midwestern city, and a place that looked like a monument to the relentless grind of the American working class, a struggling establishment named the Sunrise Grill, a structure of peeling paint and neon signs that had long since flickered out, a beacon of perpetual dawn that had seen too many sunsets, and as he approached, his heart, normally a predictable steady drum of confidence, began to beat with a strange unfamiliar mix of fear and anticipation, because in that moment, Alexander Vance, the billionaire, ceased to exist, and only Al, the poor man seeking truth, remained, ready to face the unfiltered reality he had deliberately avoided for the last 2 decades. The interior of the Sunrise Grill was a chronological exhibit of neglect and persistence, a place where time was measured, not in minutes, but in layers of stale grease and the comforting clatter of ceramic mugs, immediately immersing Al in the manufactured authenticity of his new reality, the atmosphere thick with the smell of strong, cheap coffee and sizzling bacon, the counter stools patched with silver duct tape, and the vinyl booths cracked in a spiderweb pattern of age. Yet there was a warmth here, a collective sigh of people just trying to get through the shift, and that palpable struggle was exactly what Vance had sought, a stage set for the most critical observation, and it was then, weaving through the small scattering of early morning customers, truckers, local factory workers, and a few lonely-looking old men nursing their bottomless cups, that he first saw her, the waitress whose kindness, unknowingly, was about to be put to the ultimate test, and her name, as he would later confirm from her embroidered uniform patch, was Sarah, a woman who looked permanently etched with exhaustion, her movements efficient but slow, weighted down by a fatigue that went beyond a single long shift, her blonde hair pulled back tightly, revealing tired eyes that possessed a remarkable quality. Though they clearly reflected a lifetime of disappointment, they still held a flicker of determined, gentle light, like a tiny candle shielded from a relentless wind, and Al slid into a worn booth near the back, strategically choosing a spot that allowed him to observe the entire room without drawing undue attention to his deliberately shabby appearance, a perfect cover for the investigative reporter hiding inside the pauper. And when Sarah finally reached his table, her approach was purely professional, entirely devoid of the fawning deference or immediate dismissal he was accustomed to receiving, whether as a billionaire or now as a man down on his luck. "What can I get for you, hon?" she asked. her voice a low, gravelly sound that suggested too much early morning speaking, but still carrying a polite cadence, and Al, sticking rigidly to his persona and the strict budget of his ruse, answered simply, "Just a water, please, and maybe a cup of coffee, black, if you don't mind putting it on the bill." A deliberate phrasing meant to signal his potential inability to pay immediately, a subtle, almost imperceptible stress test designed to gauge her reaction, and Sarah simply nodded, her expression unchanged, already turning away with the remarkable indifference of someone who had seen it all, a single water glass and a chipped coffee mug being delivered back to him within minutes, a small, weary service that for Alexander Vance felt like a startlingly authentic interaction, completely unpolluted by the knowledge of his true identity. For the next 30 minutes, Alf, or rather Vance, conducted his silent surveillance, watching Sarah navigate the treacherous landscape of customer service in a low-income establishment, observing a man who complained loudly about the temperature of his eggs, a woman who demanded endless free packets of sugar, and a large table that was clearly running a tab. They had no intention of settling today, and in every interaction, Sarah maintained the same unflappable, weary patience, deflecting anger with professional neutrality, and treating the demanding with the same respect as the quiet. Yet the true test of her character, the one Al had come to witness, was yet to come, and he initiated it subtly, intentionally occupying the booth for far too long, nursing his single cup of black coffee through 3 refills, pulling out a handful of crumpled small-denomination bills from his pocket, counting them dramatically, and then recounting them with a look of manufactured anxiety that was starting to feel genuinely heavy, until he finally flagged Sarah down, asking for the bill for his coffee, which she quickly provided, a meager $2.50, and as he slowly, agonizingly peeled a $2 bill and a single quarter onto the greasy tabletop, creating a deliberate, visible shortfall, he knew this was the moment of judgment, the point where the test shifted from observation to confrontation. But before he could even utter a fabricated apology about running short, Sarah, who had simply glanced at the money and then up at his worried face, performed her first unexpected act of grace, saying quietly, "You look like you need a little something more than just coffee, hon, and take a look at what happened. The cook made too much soup this morning, and it's a shame to waste it, so I brought you a cup on the house. Consider it a sample," and she placed a steaming cup of split pea soup and a small crusty bread roll on the table, a gift worth more than the entire cost of his coffee, an offering delivered with a subtle wink that signaled this was not policy, but a personal concession, and in that instant the carefully constructed wall of Al's cynicism cracked, a fissure widening across the emotional facade Alexander Vance had perfected over decades, because this wasn't charity given to a beggar, but genuine concern delivered with dignity, a quiet transaction that preserved his pride even as she supplemented his meal, and the sheer unexpected warmth of the gesture, the way she made it seem like an accident of the kitchen rather than an act of pity, sent a sudden surprising jolt of emotion through him, a feeling so raw and authentic that he had to look away, swallowing hard as he stirred the untouched soup, realizing with a sudden sinking clarity that this small, tired woman, who was clearly struggling to make ends meet herself, had just proven a point his $4 billion never could, that humanity, in its most basic form, was still capable of spontaneous, unsponsored goodness. The simple act of the soup and bread roll deepened Al's investigative focus, transforming his act of observation into an intense, almost frantic scrutiny of Sarah, as the realization dawned on him that her generosity came at a personal cost, a drain on her meager resources that she clearly couldn't afford, and soon the documentary-style progression offered a crucial digression into her reality, when, moments later, Sarah was summoned to the back by the sound of her phone ringing, the tone of her voice, now low and hushed, carrying an immediate sharp tension that was instantly discernible, and Al, using the keen auditory skills honed on years of high-stakes corporate espionage, strained to listen, catching fragments of the conversation that painted a chillingly clear picture of her hidden burden, words like eviction notice, late payment, and hospital bill cutting through the background noise of the diner, revealing that the woman who had just paid for a portion of his meal was herself facing a financial cliff edge, her personal world crumbling around her while she tirelessly served the indifferent public, and armed with this explosive contextual information, Al made his final, most difficult test, deliberately failing to secure enough change to cover even the soup he was not supposed to be charged for, pulling out all his remaining crumpled bills and scattering them haphazardly, a performance of utter financial defeat designed to force a high-stakes reaction. And he looked up at Sarah, allowing his eyes to hold a genuine, heartbreaking look of shame, confessing, I'm sorry I came up short. I thought I had it. I truly did. I can only cover the coffee and a little bit more, maybe 50 cents short for the soup, a confession that was a direct violation of the diner's rules and one that, in this struggling environment, could result in a verbal dressing down or a report to the manager, whose large imposing figure Al had already noted lurking near the cash register. But Sarah didn't even flinch. Instead, she swiftly covered the crumpled cash with her hand, pulling out a couple of coins from the tip jar, a tip jar that held mere dollars and cents, the total financial accumulation of her morning efforts, and with a fluid, seamless motion, she covered the shortfall, not even hesitating for a fraction of a second, not looking at the manager, but locking eyes with Al, and she delivered the most potent line of the entire investigation. "Don't you worry about it, Al. It's covered, seriously," her voice low and quick, a conspiratorial whisper designed to save him from embarrassment, adding, "Just make sure you get a better breakfast next time, okay? You look like you need it." And the complete sacrifice of her minimal earnings, a sacrifice made directly after hearing about her impending eviction, hit Al with the force of a physical blow, a stunning juxtaposition of her immense personal crisis and her instantaneous unwavering empathy for a stranger she believed was worse off than herself, proving that her kindness was not a luxury, but a core, undeniable function of her very being, a revelation that instantly shattered the walls of his cynical detachment. The shock of Sarah's sacrifice, the 25 cents she pulled from her precious tip money to save a complete stranger from embarrassment, knowing her own landlord was threatening to throw her family out, was the precise moment Al's entire cynical framework buckled and collapsed, and the emotional response was immediate, overwhelming, and entirely unscripted, a deluge of genuine feeling that the billionaire had suppressed for decades. The profound, agonizing guilt of his pretense mixed with the blinding realization that the one thing he couldn't buy, unconditional, pure-hearted kindness, had just been given to him freely by the person who needed money the most, and as the tears welled up, hot and unexpected, blurring the chipped Formica countertop, he knew he couldn't remain at the table for another second, excusing himself abruptly with a whisper, "Restroom, I'll be right back," before stumbling toward the back of the diner, where, safe in the peeling institutional bathroom, the full, crushing weight of the experience finally hit him, and Alexander Vance, the master of the universe, the man who controlled markets and dictated global policy, found himself sobbing uncontrollably, not tears of sorrow or pity, but of overwhelming gratitude and utter humility, realizing that his wealth had not protected him, but rather shielded him from the beautiful, terrible truth of human connection, and he wiped his face roughly, the cold water splashing against his eyes, a painful reminder that the test was over, the experiment had yielded its result, and now the pretense had to end immediately. But as he emerged, composed but visibly shaken, the tension in the dining room had escalated, drawn tight around Sarah and the imposing, red-faced manager Frank, who stood directly over her at the counter, their interaction clearly audible to the few remaining customers, having reached a critical flashpoint. "That's 3 times this month, Sarah," Frank hissed, his voice trembling with frustrated authority. "You're covering shortages again. 50 cents here, 75 cents there. I saw you. You paid for that bum in the back booth yourself." And Sarah, exhausted but refusing to crack, held her chin high, responding, "It was a mistake on the bill, Frank, a rounding error. I corrected it," desperately trying to deflect the blame, to save herself and protect Al, who was still standing frozen, just yards away, an audience to the consequence of his own deceit, and the manager, relentless, scoffed, "A mistake, or another one of your soft-hearted gestures that drains my profits," his voice rising in volume, creating a cinematic moment of confrontation that instantly drew all eyes, and it was at that exact, high-pressure beat, as Sarah's tired eyes began to glisten with the threat of tears, that Al finally broke the fourth wall of his pretense, taking 2 long determined strides forward, stepping directly between Sarah and the manager, ending the ruse with a single clear, authoritative statement that cut through the noise, leaving a vacuum of stunned silence in its wake, revealing the truth he had tried so hard to hide. The silence in the Sunrise Grill was immediate and absolute, broken only by the low hum of the fluorescent lights, as all eyes, especially Frank the manager's and Sarah's, fixed upon the disheveled man who had just placed himself in the line of fire, and Al, shedding the defeated posture of Al and reclaiming the steely resolve of Alexander Vance, looked Frank directly in the eye, his voice calm but infused with the unwavering authority of command, stating, "The shortages covered Frank every single cent." He reached into the inner pocket of his threadbare borrowed jacket, retrieving not a wad of crumpled bills, but a black, sleek, platinum-embossed card, a card that screamed exclusivity and wealth to anyone who recognized the material, and tossed it onto the counter with a soft, final thud, adding, "In fact, I'd like to cover the last 3 months of shortages and the next 12, then turning to face a bewildered Sarah, whose face registered a mixture of fear, confusion, and utter exhaustion, he revealed the investigation's stunning conclusion. "My name isn't Al, it's Alexander Vance, and I came here to see if genuine human kindness still existed, and you, Sarah, were the only person to pass the test." And he quickly produced an old, slightly bent driver's license from his back pocket, flashing his actual picture and name to confirm the impossible truth, sending a wave of stunned gasps across the few customers who were now openly staring, watching this real-life documentary unfold right in front of them, and Frank, the picture of impotent rage, melting into dumbfounded shock, could only stammer incoherently, but Al was focused only on Sarah, looking at her with eyes that were still wet from his earlier emotional breakdown, a genuine smile replacing the cynical grimace he had worn for years, and he explained the profound impact of her small acts of grace, telling her, "That soup, that 25 cents you sacrificed, it was the most valuable thing anyone has ever given me." And then, without dramatic flair but with the simple fact-heavy delivery of a man making a corporate decree, he laid out his final, life-changing offer. "I saw the phone call, Sarah. I know about the eviction notice and the hospital bills, and I'm offering you a clean slate, a genuine return on your investment in humanity," detailing his plan to immediately settle all her family's outstanding debts, establish a substantial non-revocable trust fund to ensure her parents' care, and then, with the single-minded focus of a visionary, he finished the transaction. "But that's not all, Sarah. I'm also buying this diner, effective immediately, and you're going to be the new owner, running it your way, a place where people like you are protected and rewarded for their kindness." And Sarah, completely overwhelmed, her gentle light finally flickering in astonishment, didn't move, the sheer weight of the impossible reality grounding her complete, unable to believe that a single cup of soup and a quarter could buy her the entire future, an unexpected dramatic conclusion to an investigation that had, in the end, saved not her but the cynical heart of the billionaire who had orchestrated the entire event. The immediate aftermath of the billionaire's reveal was, as you might expect, a scene of absolute cinematic chaos, though it quickly settled into a stunned, disbelieving quiet. Frank, the former manager, simply stood frozen in place, processing the fact that the bum he had just berated was now his new boss, and the person he'd been scolding was now the owner of the entire establishment, and Al, now firmly Alexander Vance again, though still dressed in his worn-out disguise, took a moment to collect the platinum card from the counter, nodding once at Sarah, signaling that this was not a dream, but a definitive, irreversible transaction, and Sarah, having finally absorbed the impossible truth, simply placed her hand over her mouth, a single silent tear running down her cheek, not a tear of sadness or exhaustion, but one of pure disbelieving relief, the exhaustion of a lifetime momentarily lifting from her shoulders, and Vance, seeing that solitary tear, felt the familiar prickle behind his own eyes, a soft, genuine ache of feeling that confirmed his experiment's success, realizing that the act of giving this gift was infinitely more rewarding than the act of accumulating the wealth that made it possible, and before the local media could descend or the rest of the neighborhood could swarm the diner, Vance made a few crucial definitive calls on a burner phone he had kept hidden, mobilizing his legal team and a hand-picked team of accountants to finalize the transfer of the diner and the establishment of Sarah's trust, ensuring that every detail was handled with the rapid-fire efficiency of a hostile takeover, except this was an act of extreme generosity, not corporate raiding, and he left the details in the capable hands of his staff, knowing his presence would only complicate things further. And as he walked toward the door, turning back for one final look, Sarah looked directly at him, offering a slight, genuine smile of pure, unadulterated thanks, a quiet moment of recognition between two people whose lives had been forever altered by a single cup of soup and a quarter, and Vance walked back out into the bright morning sun, no longer the cynical billionaire, no longer the penniless Al, but a man who had paid $4 billion just to feel a single moment of authentic human kindness, an expense he realized was entirely worth it. In the weeks that followed the stunning takeover of the Sunrise Grill, the local community, initially reeling from the news, began to witness the tangible ripple effects of Alexander Vance's radical social experiment, where Sarah, now the owner, transformed the struggling establishment into a bustling, successful hub, not by changing the menu drastically, but by implementing a simple, profound new policy that reflected her own nature, a mandatory pay-it-forward system that ensured no one who came in hungry was ever turned away, the kindness she had so freely given now baked into the very foundation of the business. And as for Vance himself, he returned to the glass tower of Vance Global, but he was no longer the isolated, cynical master of the universe. The layers of emotional armor he had worn for 2 decades, having been stripped away by the raw exposure of his time as Ali, and the change was subtle, but undeniable, reflected not in grand gestures, but in the way he interacted with his own staff, taking time to genuinely listen, to see the people behind the titles, a direct result of having himself been seen, truly seen, when he had absolutely nothing to offer in return, and the investigation, which began as a cold, calculated test of human nature, had evolved into a personal, emotional rebirth. And take a look at what happened in the financial world. The transaction quickly became the subject of intense media speculation, the story of the billionaire who cried over a 25-cent donation going viral, but Vance never sought the attention, consistently refusing interviews, maintaining that the only audience he cared about was himself and Sarah, and he used his new perspective to reshape the philanthropic arm of his empire, dedicating a significant portion of his wealth, not to massive, impersonal institutions, but to small, low, hyper-focused initiatives designed to support the Sarahs of the world, the people on the edge who were too busy being kind to ask for help. A final, definitive conclusion to the test, proving that the most valuable asset in the world is not measured in billions, but in the spontaneous, unguarded moment of generosity, when a person chooses to care for a stranger. And the Sunrise Grill, now thriving, stood as a quiet, powerful monument to the truth that Alexander Vance had searched for, that kindness, even in the darkest corners of human struggle, is not just a hope but a relentless reality.